Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Borelli, and welcome to Georgetown University. I hold a position in the president's office here at the university. I'm a special assistant for interreligious initiatives. And welcome to this program, the first of two-part program this afternoon that has emerged out of an ongoing dialogue of Catholics and Evangelicals for the common good that has been meeting here at Georgetown and in cooperation with Eastern University outside of Philadelphia. I'm going to turn things over to my co-convener here, Ron Sider. Ron has been active for 45 years or more, we don't want to say exactly how long, in public policy issues and trying to bring Christians together on common ground based on biblical sources and on many of the questions and moral concerns that emerge from the Christian tradition. Ron is at Eastern University, Palmer Seminary, right? Mm-hmm. And he's going to give a little background and talk about the other members of the panel.
On my right is Dr. Kathleen Keaveney. She's both a professor of law and theology at Notre Dame and works at the intersection of law, religion, and morality, special expertise in healthcare issues. And to the far left, Dr. Glenn Stassen, who's the Smedes Professor of Christian Ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. It's probably the premier evangelical seminary in the United States. Let me begin our conversation. Catholics and Evangelicals for the Common Good really started when Glenn Stassen and a Catholic ethicist friend were talking, I think over a beer or something.
I'm a Baptist.
Cut that. About the common ground, striking common ground between a new evangelical statement for the health of the nation and Catholic social teaching. And that led to a conversation that got John Borelli and myself involved. And so we had our first meeting in 2006. We came together around those two documents, the compendium for the Church's social teaching on the Catholic side and for the evangelicals for the health of the nation. Let me tell you just a little bit about the NAE document. The National Association of Evangelicals is the largest network of evangelicals in the country. It represents 30 million evangelicals. And they had a process that started actually in 2000, went on for 3 or 4 years. Glenn and I were both involved, where we were tasked with trying to find as much common ground as we could within the very broad evangelical community on public policy. And partway through the process, a quite conservative Washington person, Diane Nippers from the Institute of Religion and Democracy, was named co-chair with me. That was a move of genius, I think, in terms of the NAE to put the two of us in the leadership. And we worked together. We were astonished at the level of common ground that we found. Basically, we said that if we're going to be evangelicals and engaged in politics, then we have to ask, what does the Bible say God cares about? And we came out arguing that an evangelical approach required a biblically balanced agenda. And by that we meant it needed to be pro-poor and pro-life, pro-family and pro-racial justice, pro-sexual integrity, and pro-creation care, peacemaking, and so on. And that represented a very significant level of agreement. It was actually unanimously approved by the large board of the National Association of Evangelicals. When we released it here at the National Press Club, there were a few evangelical voices that were unhappy, including a vice president on Focus on the Family. But it has provided the operational foundation for the National Association of Evangelicals since that time. And it represents, in fact, an emerging evangelical center. which is pro-life, pro-poor, and so on, as I've said. We've been meeting, we met in 2006, and then from 2008 on, we've met every year for about 2 days. And that's been led by Georgetown and Eastern University. The purpose was to explore how deep the common ground was, finally and really, between evangelicals and Pentecostal, evangelicals and Catholics. I don't need to remind you that it wasn't so long ago that we said fairly unkind things about each other. We wanted to ask how we could work together more effectively, and we also wanted to ask where are the ongoing differences. When you talk about how we might work together, I like to point out that about half of the voters in this country are Catholics and Evangelicals. If you add significant numbers of African Americans and Latinos, evangelical Latinos, that also share that pro-life, pro-poor, and so on agenda, then you're talking about a significantly larger number than 50% of the voters. Now, the 3 questions that are posed for this meeting are the following, and I'll make a few comments on these, and then we'll turn to the other panelists. The first question is, what is the degree to which Catholic and evangelical perspectives on the common good have in fact converged? My answer to that is, at the leadership level, there is enormous overlap. I'm inclined to say near total overlap, and that's significant change and very important. The second question is, what are the greatest divisions? I think in our conversations, 2 at least have been discussed at various times. One is that the way that evangelicals go about developing the normative framework for their thinking about politics differs from the way Catholics do that. Evangelicals tend to go to biblical revelation for that normative framework. Catholics put more emphasis on natural law. And the second area is that Catholics are probably more inclined to be supportive of a substantial role for government than evangelicals, although I don't think that the evangelical suspicion of an important role for government is really grounded in any principial, foundational, theological position, but rather much more the result of historical experience. The third question, what can and should our 2 communities do together, and how can we find greater common ground? I would say we have the common ground. The positions at the leadership level are really quite clear. And in fact, in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of cooperation between the National Association of Evangelicals, their Washington office, and the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference, whether it's immigration or nuclear issues or the Circle of Protection to protect programs to empower poor Americans, or religious freedom issues, on and on. They're in fact working together in a major way. I think that we do need to explore the reality that large numbers of laity in both the evangelical world and the Catholic world don't understand or vote the way their leaders suggest that they ought to. And one has to understand that, ask what that means, what we should do about it. It certainly means, among other things, that we need a major educational project. And I think one of the questions in that regard is, does that educational project need to be done virtually entirely separately in each of our communities, or are there some ways in which it could be done cooperatively? Well, those are my quick comments on the 3 questions. We'll now turn to John Borelli and then to Glenn Stassen. We'll save the last and the best until last with Kathy.
Good, thank you very much. I always, as Catholic co-convener, have to give my narrative of the history too. And this has been a good give and take between Ron and myself. But it's true that the Law Center accepted an offer to host a conference in 2006 around discussion of the compendium of Catholic social teaching, which is a huge document. It is a compendium. And this rather short statement for the health of the nation that it was adopted by the National Association of Evangelicals. And I worked 16 years at the Catholic Bishops' Conference in Ecumenical Interreligious Affairs, and it seemed natural for me to get involved in this. I was invited in to help co-convene it with Ron. And the unevenness of those two documents, a compendium that has all kinds of layers of Catholic teaching, from conciliar teaching to encyclicals to statements of Episcopal conferences, various ways of quoting Scripture and so forth. Like a Roman document, the paragraphs are numbered, and that's how it's cited. And so that kind of unevenness made it sort of awkward, but there was much goodwill in the themes and where we might be able to say to one another and to work together in understanding the common good and what we discern from Scripture and from our own traditions and what's needed for the present. It took us about 2 years to come up with a formula to meet. It really did. And we on the Catholic side felt a certain amount of pressure. We don't just want the usual suspects talking to one another. We want to broaden this so we get as much spectrum as we could get interested in this project to participate. And we did not want this to be a kind of what I've called negative ecumenism. We'll form a coalition because there are those that we don't want to be like. There are those that we want to go after. We wanted to make this constructive in a way. And before our first meeting in 2008, we actually had a little shot across the bow about, well, we'll see where this goes from someone who was involved in Catholics and Evangelicals together. And we have been slowly through these years often talking about what have we learned from the past and where are we going, looking at the premises that each of us bring to this discussion. What are the premises in these documents and so forth. So it's been a great journey. It's been a learning experience, and it's a core group that's pretty well held together with a few additions as we've gone along. I do think that we have come to understand better what we each mean by the common good and how we have drawn from various aspects of our tradition in identifying the common good and discussing it. And we have much more to learn here. But so much of the time in the past was spent defining ourselves over and against one another. We have needed more and more time to understand one another on each other's own terms. I mean, I grew up in Oklahoma, and in the mid-'60s working with mostly Southern Baptists. When we were cleaning up at night, I had to defend the faith. And I had to say, well, I am who I am because I don't believe this, which you do. And they'd say, well, we are who we are because we don't believe in confession, you know. And so, and we've got to get beyond that and to see each other constructively. And I think we've done a great deal of that. But every meeting, this unevenness, and I think that's one of the areas, we read Scripture differently. We do draw from Scripture and we pray at our meetings, but we've never, and the old question of Scripture and tradition still is at work. Vatican II, which is a key period for us Catholics, and we're celebrating the 50th anniversary this October of the opening of the Second Vatican Council, didn't solve the question of Scripture and tradition, but it set it up in a new way that it can be discussed in a constructive way. And so we've talked about that. We've talked about magisterium and the relationship of scholars and theologians to the magisterium, which is an age-old issue in the Catholic Church, and how teaching documents emerge in the Church. And knowing that among evangelicals, there's a lack of a magisterium, or we've not found it yet. It may be working there, and in fact proposing that it might be in certain places and you're not aware of it. And among scholars, among the sages, among those who have taken responsibility for teaching the clergy, perhaps. And that's one area. So the unevenness of authority in our tradition, the unevenness or the difference in the ways we use our resources are areas where we really, truly have to get to know one another better, and these differences remain. But much friendship and kindness, and when you pray together and you express views together on issues that are of common concern, issues of war and peace, immigration, finding much common ground on immigration. We attempted midway through this dialogue to do an op-ed piece, and we thought with our two early conveners, Pastor Rick Warren and Cardinal McCarrick, we had a winner of an op-ed piece on some of these issues during the Christmas holidays. And with great effort, we failed. And that was going to be a kind of launch of what we've been trying to do. One of the things that was most fascinating to me as a Catholic, to hear the stories of the evangelicals. Just ask at a Catholic-Evangelical conversation, tell us your personal religious history. Which churches have you worshiped in? It's quite an interesting tale, and everyone had a different tale, much different than us Catholics. We're debating over which parish we feel comfortable in. But it's a very interesting story, and it's helpful and educating to us. I think we do have convergence on the common good. NAE continues to work. It's an organization that's been in existence for over 60 years. Is that correct? 70 years. Thank you, Galen. And it continues to work, and it continues to thrive and to build on consensus. And so that's important, and that's a structure that's working. And as we heard last night, on a number of issues that are seldom make it into the media, Catholics and Evangelicals have cooperated in reminding politicians, reminding legislators to keep the poor in mind, even though they're falling through the cracks during the present economic crisis, and other key issues like that. So, Glenn.
Good. Okay. Well, I am a Baptist who would fear if we got a magisterium, because I'm afraid what Baptist would be in charge of this. I'm also a Baptist evangelical who really appreciates Catholic social teaching. We make that very clear as I think the model for us in the textbook Kingdom Ethics, Following Jesus in Contemporary Context, that David Gushie and I wrote. And so I read Catholic social teaching as well as evangelical stuff and so on. And I read the title really is the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, not Social Teaching of the Church. I mean, it means the same thing. I think isn't that the exact title? The Compendium?
Yes.
Social Doctrine of the Church, that Catholics produced. And the Toward an Evangelical Public Policy, the equally long document that Ron Sider led in producing, really came out, I thought, very well. I was really pleased with how good it was. But also they are so similar. These are two volumes about the same length, and have very fine teaching. So I met with Joseph Fahey, Catholic ethicist, at the Clam Chowder Bar in Bay Shore, New Jersey, New York rather, right across from Fire Island. And it wasn't beer, it was clam chowder, to get it straight.
Sorry about that.
Joe also, had read the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. I think he hadn't read our document. But we decided it would really be interesting if we got a conference together of Catholic and Evangelical scholars who would point out the commonalities. It's really striking. This happened a year or two before all the incidents that you've heard about. So you see, I'm right about the origin. I mean, what if 1965 precedes, 2005 precedes 2006. Anyhow, so we did that. But then Ron and John have really been our leaders, along with Cardinal McCarrick and so on, as you mentioned. And we've had a really interesting time together in these 5 years. First of all, the question we were supposed to ask: what degree have our views converged over the past decade? And I want to say that, for one thing, evangelicals are starting to develop a tradition in public ethics, I hope, or what Ron called a centrist kind of understanding. I'm encouraged. See, Catholics are so way ahead of evangelicals, but evangelicals are starting to develop a teaching that many of us can feel good about. So maybe we finally can be dialogue partners. I think that's one sort of convergence. The toward an evangelical public policy mentions the common good, the Catholic term, 32 times, and always favorably. And then the little small document for the health of the nation, which corresponds with a small Catholic document, advocates it 3 times explicitly, but a bunch of times by synonyms. So we're really converging on that, and that's one kind of convergence. Secondly, we both are teaching strongly that all persons are created in the image of God, and therefore human dignity, and therefore human rights for all. These run through our documents, and so that's a great commonality. The human rights include the right to life, and also those justice needs like a home, a place of food, and health care, and so on, that are necessary to life. Secondly, it includes the right to liberty, religious liberty and civic liberty. And mentioning your experience in Oklahoma, in the 60s, in my experience also in Minnesota, there were Baptists who would criticize Catholics for their opposition to religious liberty. There was prejudice there. And the document on religious liberty in Vatican II has just been enormously important for our convergence. I haven't heard those kinds of criticisms of Catholics since like the 60s or 70s or something like that, even though I've taught among many Baptists. And that's one of the crucial, of course, human rights. Then nobody else mentions this, I guess, but I want to mention it. We both have an emphasis on the suffering of Jesus. Evangelicals speak a great deal about the cross, about the atonement, and so on. But Catholics also, sacred, well, the Sacred Heart of Mary. But I mean, there's a good bit of emphasis on Jesus' suffering, which also relates to sensitivity to people who suffer from violence, violation of the human rights, from poverty, and from hunger, and so forth. So those run through our traditions. And also through that is the common emphasis on peacemaking. The challenge of peace, the Catholic document, the just peacemaking paradigm that others and I have led in developing. Those are commonalities. Also, we both have a sense of Catholic teaching on subsidiarity. That is, you should get things solved on the lower level you can, if you can, but then you need the federal government or state government when it's a bigger issue that we can't just solve locally. There are some parallel evangelical kinds of teachings. Evangelicals, in fact, we are saying to each other, are somewhat more individualistic than Catholics with the emphasis on community. But evangelicals are seeking to correct that. Then also, I'm so pleased with the tremendous flowering of Catholic biblical scholarship in the second half of the 20th century. Evangelicals have, always emphasized a biblical grounding for our kind of ethic. And now there's I guess it's the one place where, we're catching up, evangelicals. It's the one place where Catholics, they were probably already ahead, but they're doing all this publishing in the second half of the 20th century. So those are parts of convergence. My other 2 points are much quicker. The second is where the greatest divisions remain, and I don't think they're between us. They're between the teaching and those evangelicals and Catholics who have a very individualistic kind of laissez-faire, kind of Ayn Rand type, my rights and let others fend for themselves, kind of a loyalty, which is not faithful to either of our traditions. And so we just need to do persuasion. And finally, what should be done to achieve greater common ground? I just think it's keep working together and to persuade each of our members who are not as faithful to the better teaching in our two traditions, just as Ron said at the beginning.
Okay, after hearing these three, I think, wonderful presentations about what we've done. I don't know if I've got much left to say, but I first want to thank John and Ron for having called us together and really provided the leadership, and Georgetown and Eastern University for hosting this. Alistair McIntyre talks about the importance of practices in religious traditions, but he also says you need institutions who can sustain practices, and these institutions have really stepped up to the plate and facilitated our conversation. Right. One of the interesting things to me about this process, or our conversations together, is maybe a tension and maybe an uncertainty about what it is we are trying to do together. And I see two things that we've been trying to do, and it's not at all clear to me how they interrelate. And one thing is, well, we're getting together as a group of concerned citizens, you know, to influence the political process, to convince people to work for the common good, you know, along a broader program of social justice and the common good. More activism, writing op-eds. The other piece of the picture has been, you know, really more of a scholarly effort to try to go deeper into the sources of the Catholic and the evangelical tradition in order to try to understand what's at stake there. And there was a wonderful meeting, I think, at the Society of Christian Ethics, which we belong to, a big umbrella organization of ethics that looked at some of these issues. There was a meeting of scholars from Calvin College and Wheaton College and the University of Notre Dame, where I teach, you know, looking at a symposium on the common good, on Lou Daly's book. So there's been some effort to see what sources we can look at together that are rooted into the tradition that help shed some light on the current issues. And I think it's going to be important if this project is going to move forward, to be able to proceed along both fronts. Just proceeding on one front isn't going to be enough. Because whenever you're advocating something in the public square, whenever you're advocating a program, I mean, there's always questions about exceptions, or how far to push it, or how far one right conflicts with another, or what are the most important things to pursue at a particular time. And that can't just be answered by the political program. That has to be answered within a broader view of human flourishing, and there needs to be dialogue about what that is. What's been interesting for me as a Roman Catholic being involved in this dialogue is that I don't know if my colleagues would agree, but part of it's been an issue of learning how the other talks, how we express our faith, how we express our commitments. It doesn't come as naturally, and I appreciate, and you know, we've got some wonderful biblical scholars in the Catholic tradition, but it's not news to people that scriptural sayings do not roll off most Catholic tongues. I mean, that's not a way, that hasn't shaped our sensibility to the same extent I think it has evangelicals. And learning how, say, you know, how evangelicals look at this versus how Catholics look at this, by this meaning the whole world, has been, I think, very helpful for me. I would think that the funny thing that you see about Catholic dialogue is, among ourselves, and speaking with evangelicals, I think has made this clearer, is we have a technical vocabulary of moral theology that makes, you know, the tax code look simple. We have subsidiarity, cooperation with evil, intrinsic evil, all of these technical terms, you know, the object of the act, you know, all of this is well defined. And we get into, very often in the Catholic tradition, talking to one another about this. I think it was the philosopher Alistair McIntyre who once said, you know, the thing about Roman Catholic theologians is that they're most interested in talking to other Roman Catholic theologians, you know, because there is this language of, so having to kind of get out of your own self, your own tradition, to be able to articulate it to somebody who hasn't been socialized in that way really helps you learn to focus, to prioritize, and to make your case in a more intelligible way. So what I have found about the dialogue that's been very helpful is that it's made me have to go back in my own mind and think, okay, why do I think this? What's important about this? How can I explain this to somebody that doesn't have the whole system? What is their response going to be, and how can I take that seriously? Because any kind of dialogue with somebody who's not yourself, I think you have to see, and Dr. Borelli's really the expert on that, is a common pursuit of truth. And I think that that's part of what we've all been involved in here, bringing our resources together for that.
We're going to talk together for a little bit, asking each other questions, and then we'll invite you to put some questions to us. I'm going to just start this with a question, picking up something that Glenn said, and also Kathy. I'm inclined to think that one of the things I learned in this process is that the differences within the Catholic community on the issues we're talking about, and the issues within the evangelical world are much greater than the differences of the official teaching of both communities. I'm almost even inclined to think that I've discovered that Catholics disagree even more intensely than evangelicals do, and I didn't think that was possible. So I would ask Glenn and anybody else to comment a little more on that. Kathy, you said that we've been trying to do two things, trying to shape the public debate, but also to do more scholarly work. And would you just comment a little more on whether you think those are incompatible or, in fact, mutually reinforcing, and how that would work?
Well, I think it can be both. In some circumstances, I think it can be, mutually reinforcing if you understand the roots of the commitment. But I also think it can be intention. Any kind of political activity has to, I think, well, at least from a scholar's point of view, we're eggheads, we love detail, might have to oversimplify matters before they can, be put into, something that's going to fit into an op-ed or to a political slogan. So I think it's important not to get to that point where we're just looking at political programs and not at least keep open to the sources of our commitments.
On Kathy's first point, what are we trying to do in terms of influencing public policy? In 2004, when I was first here, or after the 2004 election, actually, we were sitting around in a group in the president's office talking about the growing polarization in this country and how bad it seemed after the 2004 election, and what could we do in a positive way to address the polarization, especially along religious grounds, that was growing in the country. And so we started exploring ways. We consulted. I remember consulting with Brian Hare, who at one time was head of the Peace and Justice Office at the Bishops' Conference. And his comment was, do something that's not being done elsewhere. And that's when this opportunity in '06 fell into our hands, I think, this exploratory consultation between Catholics and Evangelicals. It just sort of was there. Well, maybe this is something we could pick up and shape after a couple of years of discussion. To clarify a point Glenn made, Toward an Evangelical Public Policy is a collection of papers on a variety of topics by individuals. At least one's a Catholic. I can't recall if there's more than one Catholic in there.
Kristen Heyer.
Yeah. And then the appendix is this text that was adopted by NAE for the health of the nation. The compendium is layer upon layer of excerpts from Catholic teachings, whether from Second Vatican Council or from Rerum Novarum or from Episcopal Conference or from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It takes a guide to read the text and to talk about the layers of authority here, which is, I think, very difficult for us to convey. Well, this is a conciliar teaching. This is rather important. well, this came from here, and it represents a position from this particular office in the Vatican, which doesn't rank, but it has to be taken with consideration. So that kind of, we're still kind of struggling with that. At the same time, as a Catholic ecumenist, I'm very much committed to restoring the unity among Christians. Now, some of our evangelical friends here are in churches that didn't really break from the Catholic Church. They represent a break among Protestants. Some do. Ron's own church, the Mennonites, had a very bad experience with the Catholic Church a few centuries ago. I shouldn't even make this humorous.
Also the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Anglicans too.
They were not nice too. And, but there have been...
They drowned us to death, to be specific. They baptized us a third time and held us under.
Right. We don't do that anymore. We don't repeat baptisms. So, there is an international dialogue between the Vatican and the Mennonites addressing some of these things. So some of those can be addressed. But doing the kind of work we're doing, even though we haven't talked about how our churches are moving along on certain courses, and maybe they will approximate in time where we can look at the obstacles that keep us apart. We haven't discussed that. But we've looked at very deep, serious social problems where we have a great deal of communion and agreement. And how can we make this better known? And how can we show that our concerns about war and peace, about international interventionism, about racism and continuing forms of racism, about immigration and so forth, social justice, really need, very often we're presented at odds over some of these older questions, but we really have much to say, and we can learn from one another in a scholarly way too, as Kathy was saying.
Yeah, we've all seen that I think almost all of us in this dialogue have the consistent ethic of life. It runs through us. That's certainly true of Ron and me as evangelicals, and certainly true in Catholic teaching, and the human rights for the less powerful, the immigrants, the poor, the widows, the orphans. Great concern about justice for the poor in this country. This is in the budget process that our country's undergoing, this is from Sojourners when they're talking about cutting the budget. Would they cut out the poor or would they cut out the weapons? This says, what would Jesus cut? That's my evangelical statement about this question. Consistent ethic of life and justice for the poor. That really runs through both of us. I do want to say about our Toward an Evangelical Public Policy book. You said it was a collection of articles, but then there was a group process for revising the articles and getting them in, sort of so that we could all agree with them. So they're not just scattered chapters.
No.
And then, as you say, the appendix, which is also published separately for the health of the nation, was endorsed by all the board members of the National Association of Evangelicals, and that's the summary of it. So there are the two different documents.
The other thing that I think is worth adding is, I mean, I think it would be unfair to represent everybody who sat around the table as agreeing with one another on every issue. I mean, I think that's, there is significant difference, and as you pointed out, among Catholics, and I'm sure among evangelicals as well. And I think that, maybe not the full spectrum of that, but some of that was represented in that room. And I think it's important maybe to start thinking, about how we think about disagreement. I mean, there are different kinds of disagreement, right? There would be a disagreement with teaching that would say, well, I don't think human beings are anything other than, materialist blobs of dust, and so they're not worth anything at all. That would be more outside the pale of the conversation and saying, well, I agree with you, say, about, the importance of religious liberty, but how are we going to work this out in a pluralistic society? Or I agree with you, that families are important. How are we actually going to protect this, in a situation where there are so many, people who, are facing so many, divorce and other sorts of things? And I think that we need to be able to acknowledge that there are disputes within a tradition that are also drawing on the common sources. And I think also it's important not to write people out, whether they're in this room or not in this room, who disagree with us on the grounds that, well, they just need to be re-educated. That bothers me, because some of them may, but some of them may have disagreements that we need to learn from and to think about and to talk with in a civil way. If you write your opponents off as not worth listening to and not worth talking to, then I don't think we're embodying, fundamentally the confidence in the idea that God created, the world and created human minds, and we can talk to each other on the basis.
Let me ask you a question right there, Kathy. How important do you think it ought to be in the next little while for...
The next little while?
Yeah, I'm meaning the next 5-10 years.
Okay, just checking.
for Catholics to invest a lot more effort in finding common ground across the huge divide that's there on social issues. Is that an important task? And the same question, of course, for evangelicals. If we're going to really shape this society on what we all agree is common ground that's articulated by the teaching of our two communities, we're probably going to have a heck of a lot more dialogue within our communities than we have thus far. How important is that, and how would you do it?
Well, I think, gosh, I don't think anybody ever accused Catholics of not talking to each other. There's a lot of magazines that are, bringing all of this up. But I think these are contentious issues. We are talking about them. One of the interesting things in the Catholic community, I think, is after Vatican II, there was a tremendous openness, to the world and an attempt to kind of engage with other people. I think in the past 20 years, there's been much more of what I would call, instead of a current of openness, a current of identity. We've been trying to go back and figure out what it means to have a Catholic identity. Institutions have been trying to figure out what it means to be true to that identity. I would like to see us move from this current of identity, which I'm not saying isn't important, to more of a current of engagement, so that while we're talking about our own issues, we're also bringing that back into an engagement with the world. It's not an uncritical openness to every idea that's flying by, but is a nuanced and critical engagement with it and sorting through what's good and what's not.
But a dialogue setting is often a foil for getting people to talk within their own communities. Yeah. And in fact, in dialogue, it's you actually grow in your understanding of your own position in the faith as you articulate it. And so I think finding ways for evangelicals and Catholics to come together on some of these social issues and talk about them and the roots of our teaching on these is something we need to promote. Now, how can you do this in an age when it seems that there's more and more budget cuts, and it takes an enormous amount of staffing and training, getting the idea into education of ministry and the levels of ministry, the different kinds of ministry that we have in the church now. Lay ministers, can we teach people and give people the confidence to reach out and to be able to establish these kinds of conversations. Goodness knows there's enough material out there and more could be produced. But it's how do you, given everything that's going on these days and how busy people are, how can we teach this as a priority? I'm not quite sure.
Any more questions that you want to put to each other, or shall we? Let's then invite.
There are two roving
questions.
mics, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Okay, there are mics out there. Just step to one of those mics and put a question to
There's
one of us.
People with, yeah, raise your hand. There you go.
Steve Winters, local researcher. As I understand it, the Conference of U.S. Catholic Bishops has just recently launched a massive initiative to try to educate or engage with Americans on the topic of religious liberty in America. And they're hoping that by doing this, they're also going to bring in groups, religious groups and others who are not Catholics but who recognize this important tradition. And under the view of the bishops, it's under extreme threat at the moment. I think Cardinal Dolan and, say, President Garvey over at Catholic University of America have spoken very eloquently on this. Now, this would seem to be an ideal topic for your group to be addressing. Are you planning to address this initiative?
Well, we had a very lively discussion of precisely that issue last night, and I think it would be fair to say that the Vice President for Public Policy from the National Association of Evangelicals and the head of the U.S. Catholic Bishops operation, Galen Carey and John Carr, pretty much agreed that a very important issue of religious freedom is at stake here. So yeah, we talked about it intensely last night, and we came back to it today. It's on our agenda.
But I guess I would also say that, you know, that's also an extremely complicated issue in a pluralistic society. How you protect religious liberty while also, which has never been seen as an absolute in the Roman Catholic tradition or in the constitutional tradition, while looking at some of the other goods that are at stake, is one of those issues that's, you know, very hard to talk about, but is very important to talk about in a clear-eyed and principled manner, and not in overheated you know, rhetoric. And I think it's important that we all engage in this discussion as Americans, looking at not just what's good for us, but the golden rule. I mean, I think the golden rule is a really wonderful, you know, principle that's in common for all of us. Not just what do I want or what do I need, but how do I think about things from your perspective too before I make a final decision on what we're going to do.
The place where this, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
No, you go ahead.
The place where this became interesting for us last night, or controversial, was the human right to religious liberty, which we're talking about. But then many people feel that there is also, obviously almost all of us feel, a human right to health care. It's important for the right to life, to get medical care. But then a small part of the health care is there a right to contraception, which many evangelicals think the answer is yes, so that if you're poor, you don't end up having more babies than you could afford, and stuff like that. You know, and then in the health care bill that has been passed, how do we define, you know, the accommodations that have happened so that the Obama administration has said that the insurance companies will pay for the contraception, but not the Catholic hospitals or such. But then how you define what's a religious institution in the regulations and so on gets the two rights entangled, and seems to many bishops to narrow down what is a religious institution and the rights of religious liberty. The really interesting issues always happen between one right and another right, and how can you define it in such a way as to respect both rights? But then, of course, many people don't think contraception is a right, so that's also a question.
The nation's learning a great deal about religious liberty because of all of this. If you're following the media, if you're reading blogs, there's a great deal of education going on and a great deal of discussion going on. I just wanted to say that in a way the Catholics are newcomers to this, in that the issue was really officially discussed and stated for the first time 50 years ago at the Second Vatican Council. When the council was called and a Secretariat for Christian Unity was established, Cardinal Augustin Bea, who headed it, had a off-the-record consultation with the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Willem Vissertuft. And it had to be off the record because there wasn't an official status yet where they could officially meet. So they met at some convent in Milan, which is an interesting story in itself. But when they met, Vissertuft said, if you're going to make a statement on Christian unity and ecumenism, you also have to make a statement on religious liberty, or you'll have no integrity. So from the start and from the outside, Catholics were advised, and the Secretariat for Christian Unity, as the politics of Vatican II sorted out, took on the responsibility for that declaration. We've come a long way since then, and now religious liberty is a major concern spoken by Catholic bishops over a particular way that religious institutions are being defined or tested in the current discussion.
Another question, comment?
Liz Tennedy with On Faith at the Washington Post. So today we find out that Mitt Romney has enough delegates to be the GOP nominee, and I'm wondering, what does it say about the state of identity within these two communities, the Catholic and Evangelical world, that we have a Mormon taking over their party? Traditionally, you know, they were the ones to talk in the last 20 years about religious issues. And I'm curious how you think that the language of the Catholic social teaching and as well as on the evangelical side, how that language is likely to be used in this election by a Mormon who hesitates to talk about his own religious identity.
This is a Protestant issue, isn't it?
Well, I would I would say that there are certainly some evangelicals who will be uneasy about voting for a Mormon because of fundamental theological issues. I suspect that that'll be a relatively small percentage. It's still the case that a large percentage of evangelicals vote Republican, and I suspect that most of those will find their uneasiness about his Mormonism trumped by other concerns. But there will be some, I suspect, that find it hard to vote for him.
What I think is interesting is, you know, when we talk about religious freedom or religious rights, it's never just, you know, in the political sphere, pure religion that we're worrying about, at least in America. I mean, in other parts of the world, we are worried about, you know, pure religion and your belief systems and what freedom you have to worship. But what we are concerned with, I think, in the United States really is what somebody's fundamental view of the world says about how they're going to organize, you know, public policy, how they're going to treat, you know, different categories of people, women, you know, and so the question really is from my perspective, you know, is somebody a Mormon or a Catholic? You know, even over the John Kennedy speech, it was how are you going to make decisions that affect all of us, and what is going to be the basis for those decisions? And those are questions that we ask and we should ask of all of our politicians, irrespective of religions. How do you define what you think the good is? How are you going to treat all of the people in our diverse country? And what is going to be the basis of your decisions? And I think, you know, Romney will get asked those questions, Obama will get asked those questions, and the questions about how our common life is shaped are legitimate questions.
Yeah, let me comment too. I think Fuller Seminary, where I teach, has 4,000 students. We're the largest seminary there is, I guess. Not one Mormon. I don't think Mormons are allowed to teach, to study at Fuller, although our president, Rich Mao, has been in very interesting dialogues with Mormon leaders. But religious liberty is very clear constitutionally. There's no religious test for office. Right. I want to ask about Romney, not so much as I don't want to ask whether he's a Mormon. Yeah. I want to ask what are his policies on economic justice in a nation where the rich are getting so much richer and CEOs' salaries are 400 times the workers' salaries and so on, and the poverty issues we have and so forth, and all the other, you know, peacemaking issues and right to life issues and so on. Those are the questions I want to ask of a Mitt Romney or an Obama. I do want to say something that isn't precisely on the question, but that we should just think about. All this violence in Syria has a lot to do with the fact that if Assad would lose, his Alawites would likely lose just would be oppressed a lot, you know, by the Shiites who would take over. And it's a Shiite Sunni and a fear that if your leader isn't in charge of your country, there's going to be violence done against your people because they don't have the human rights tradition that we have. They don't have the religious liberty tradition that we have. Obviously, not a person in this room fears that if Mitt Romney would be elected, somehow Mormons would be the official religion and Catholics and Baptists would be illegal. I mean, that's just not anywhere in our imagination. So I just want to say to celebrate the importance of the human rights tradition that we have.
And in terms of religious liberty, I mean, I think the American treatment of Mormons, was really one of the most, significant repressions of religious, of religious organization, through the whole, what they did in order to stop polygamy. And then arguably, it was the pressure on the part of the U.S. government that was at least partially responsible for getting them to change their doctrine on that. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that's quite a significant intrusion into a religion's framework. And so the fact that a Mormon can be, run as a credible candidate for president of the United States in the United States, I think says something wonderful, about our inclusiveness of religion. Whether or not you're in favor of Romney on the grounds that we assess or not. But the fact that we've come that far, I think, is a good thing.
I think it's not a matter so much of whether Romney uses this language or Obama uses this language, whether presidential candidates or any politician. If any politician at least tries to incorporate the language that comes out of the Catholic social tradition or of your growing evangelical social tradition in a way that's good because it puts the language in the public sphere, I think the worry is that these issues won't be raised. If somebody raises them, then you can offer a comment or a correction or open a discussion. Getting these issues, the role of the church in society, into the election process or into the minds of people making the decisions to vote, I think is something we want. I mean, that's what's behind, I think, the statement of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, now renewed, forming consciences, in faithful citizenship, that urges Catholics to participate in the election process, to be citizens, to engage in the discussion, to make prudential judgments. And I think we want that. Very seldom does the window open for church teaching to get into some of these major issues, that it's often manipulated by candidates to their advantage, whether this is a Senate race or a presidential election.
Let's get another comment, question? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Sally Quinn from On Faith, the Washington Post, and I would like to follow up on Liz's question about the Mormons. I wish that most people in the United States had your pluralistic point of view, but as we all read, there are probably 15–20% of Americans who think that Mormonism is a cult and basically say they wouldn't vote for a Mormon. You probably may know that a few weeks ago, Rick Warren was on ABC in the morning show and said that that Mormons were not Christians because they did not believe in the Holy Trinity.
That's right.
And a few weeks later, I was at a religion conference, a Pew conference in Florida, and we brought this up. There were Mormons and evangelicals on the panel. And no one could really describe what the Holy Trinity was. I mean, we ended up having this huge argument at dinner. But also why that's important to distinguish between the Mormons and evangelicals or other Christians, why the Holy Trinity is important.
Well, I would comment that we should make a very sharp distinction between the question, is Mormon theology heretical or basically faithfully Christian? That's one question. It's a quite distinct question to say that in this society, one ought to not vote for a Mormon because his theology is heretical. I would think that overwhelmingly evangelicals, I won't speak for Catholics, think that Mormon theology is not within mainstream Christianity. But I also think that a large number, way over a majority, will in fact vote for Romney. But they won't vote for him on theological grounds. It'll be on political grounds. So there's something in your question that's simply not acceptable.
It's important in terms of canonical questions about Trinity and so forth. For a long time, there was a great deal of uncertainty among Catholics, for example, how to treat Mormon baptism. If somebody is already baptized a Mormon and becomes a Catholic, Do we baptize the person? Do we receive them conditionally with baptism? And what about a Mormon who's been married to another Christian and there's a divorce and then that Mormon wants to marry a Catholic? Do we treat that previous marriage? And so we left the question open. Mormons came to see us at the Bishops' Conference and wanted to talk about public issues. And we talked about those, but we also said we want to have some theological dialogue. We want to talk about baptism. What's your understanding of baptism? We want to talk about proselytism. Why do you think it's better for someone, and you make efforts to bring Catholics into the Mormon Church? And let's discuss these, and I think it'd be to your benefit. But they were told they couldn't have a theological discussion with us. And then sometime later, the Holy See made a judgment that Mormons are to be received with baptism. So absolutely. So they're not considering Mormons as Christians. They took an official stance. We haven't made a big deal of that. Catholics in Massachusetts must have voted for Mitt Romney if he was governor of Massachusetts. So I think it's not a matter of his particular faith and whether or not Mormonism fits into the Christian community or not. I think it is where he stands on the issues and what is he going to draw from, and the people that he surrounds himself with, who are going to people he's going to make up his cabinet and government. These are the people that will determine some of the policy and so forth.
I want to respond to the question too. There may have been an implication in your question. You said somebody couldn't define the Trinity in this the place where you were discussing. The doctrine of the Trinity is just really fundamental, very much at the heart of Christian faith. And so I wouldn't want to accept that kind of implication somehow. It means God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And that's, that's in our prayers, that's in our doctrines for all of us. It is very important. But as we're all saying, that should not be a test for office. It was a test if you would say, are they Christian or not? And most of the evangelicals would say no, that's not Christian. They got this other Bible, the Book of Mormon, and so on and so on. They also didn't let any blacks be members of their leadership for many, many years. There are problems like that, but it's about Mitt Romney and what kind of policies would he bring. That's what we're all saying. I just came from a conference at Indiana University and Purdue University, social scientists talking about younger evangelicals and about the new engagement for justice and for peacemaking among younger evangelicals. And younger evangelicals, I think, will be voting a little differently from what was described by my colleagues, according to the scientific studies done by these social scientists. They're more engaged in justice questions and peacemaking questions and so forth, on which President Obama has done quite well. And there are some questions about Romney, and those are valid questions, justice questions, peacemaking questions.
And let's not forget that, there's the disputes within Christianity about, creeds, and Jews aren't Christians either, but I don't think anybody would say, well, we would not elect a Jew president of the United States. Some people worry about Unitarians because, sure, they've got a different ecclesiology, and, they don't conform to creedal Christianity understood in the, the traditional Catholic or Evangelical way. And we've certainly had Unitarian yes, presidents of the United States. So, I think the focus always should be on what do your beliefs imply about how you're going to lead and govern the pluralistic community that we're all in. How are you going to treat people who don't believe the same thing you do, whatever it is you do believe? And that's a legitimate question. How are you going to treat me as a Catholic if you're a Mormon? How are you going to treat people who don't believe in anything? It's about the common good and the implications of your beliefs.
I just want to clarify one thing about myself. My comment that I think it'll be the case that a majority of evangelicals will vote Republican was not intended to be a normative statement. I meant to simply be descriptively just saying what I think will happen. Next question.
I'd like to follow up because I'm not clear on one thing, which is what I was saying was that Rick Warren said Mormons are not Christians because they don't believe in the Holy Trinity.
True, he said that.
And then the question is that going to be an issue? Not should it be an issue, because we all, I think most people here don't think it should be, but it clearly is for a number of people. Do you all think that Mormons are Christians?
I think that they are, they have a heretical doctrine, which is not in keeping with historic Christianity. I don't think any of us has the answer to the question you just posed. You know, we don't have hard polling data. I'm sure there will be a small percentage of evangelicals that will not vote for Romney because he's a Mormon. But I don't think anybody has the hard data on what the percentage of that will be.
I really can't say whether, I know that Mormons define themselves, many Mormons define themselves as Christians. I have to say I don't know enough about Mormon doctrine to make a judgment, but a decision was made by offices in my church that you treat, you receive a Mormon with absolute baptism. That would be that they're not Christian. They're received as someone who is not a Christian. So.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. Another question?
I'm Jason Poling. I'm an evangelical pastor in the Baltimore area. And you'll forgive me because I'm not a professional ethicist, so this is a genuine question about whether this is in bounds or not in the field of Christian ethics. Would we as evangelicals have room for considering the deep convictions of our Catholic brothers and sisters in considering, for example, the issue of contraception, whether that would be considered a right? Would it be legitimate in terms of a Christian ethical calculus to say, while we don't necessarily have a strong point of view, the fact that our brothers and sisters in the Roman Catholic tradition do, we're going to allow that to affect the way we understand the issue?
The way we understand?
The way we understand that particular issue.
Well, last night in the discussion, as I said, both the representative of the NAE and the Catholic bishops said that we have a very serious religious freedom issue here. Overwhelmingly, evangelicals think that contraception is okay. But I would say a large majority of evangelicals, certainly the official position of the National Association of Evangelicals, is that a fundamental religious freedom issue is at stake, and they do support the Catholics in that. Not unanimous position, but that's, I think, where a majority of evangelicals are.
You know that what they worked to try to get this together, the president and the and Catholics, so that the regulation has now defined that no Catholic institution or other religious institution would need to pay for insurance that would need to pay for contraceptive, stuff for people. They've worked it out. The insurance companies pay for it because it actually saves money. If people use contraceptives, they have fewer children and fewer problems, and it saves money for the insurance company. So the insurance company pays for it. That was an effort to try to get it together so nobody's rights are stepped on. But in the process, they defined what constitutes a religious institution in a way that's offensive to Catholics. And I think that definition ought to be redefined. They said very clearly in the regulations, this applies only to this question of insurance for contraceptives and not to any other issue. But so they're getting kind of together, but a lot of Catholic bishops don't think they're getting together, and it's even controversial among Catholics. I mean, but that's serious. Religious liberty is serious for all of us. So I'm just hoping that they can really, you don't have to infringe on either the way they can work it out.
And the other thing I think it's important to say is, any making of a law, any decision is always setting a precedent. And you've got a benefit package. We're trying to have something that's approaching universal health care here. And in order to do that, you have to have a standard benefit package. And what goes in the standard benefit package has to be defined by somebody. And that becomes a kind of basic right of people, kind of as Americans, at least that's aspirational. So if you've got this defined, however we've defined it, then how are you going to hold that with some kind of integrity and at the same time, protect not just Catholic objections, but objections from any possible source, because you can't just say, well, Catholics get to object on this ground, because it's not, other people can object on other grounds to other covered benefits. And you can't just say, well, the Catholics get to do what they want, but we're not going to accept the objections from other religious traditions. So one of the big challenges in any assessment of religious liberty is coming up with a rule that isn't just tied to a particular case, but will work for a general and wide range of cases. It has to be a fair rule that applies across the board. It can't just be a rule that's ad hoc, because no law can be just ad hoc and actually function as a law.
Over here.
Hi. John Carr. I work for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and there have been a number of references to our position on this. Just for purposes of clarity, there are many issues involved, and the panel has represented that well. A fundamental issue for the conference, and I think for others, is an unfortunate four-part test of what a religious institution is. It has to be involved in inculcation of religious values. It cannot serve others of different faiths, it cannot employ others of different faiths, and it has to be tax exempt. We believe, as a matter of faith, that we are required to serve the least of these. That's part of what defines us. I work for Cardinal Hickey, who in this city said many, many times, we shelter the homeless not because they are Catholic, but because we are Catholic. A core issue about which there has been no movement here is that very unfortunate test of what is religious ministry. And for the federal government to say to Catholic Charities or Evangelical or Salvation Army that if you serve others who are not members of your faith, and if you employ others in carrying out that work, you're not doing religious work. That is a fundamental problem. It is a core issue. I think it is a threat to religious freedom, and I'm hoping that the administration will come forward with a different definition. I'm hoping the Congress might fix it, or that the courts might fix it. But that is the core issue for us.
Another question?
Keelan Downton, Woodstock Theological Center. John, you talked a little bit about the difference between Catholic and Evangelical citation styles. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about different organizational styles or organizational preferences between Catholics and Evangelicals, and how that might come into play with political disagreements about, say, organizing the economy or the role of government, size of government, that sort of thing.
So in terms of organizational style, you mean the way the mode that we operate under?
In crass terms, top-down versus bottom-up. And I'll acknowledge that that's, for both Catholics and Evangelicals, somewhat complex. If you talk
Yes.
about sensus fidelium versus
Yes.
the bishops and so
And in
on.
fact, we've been trying to get past that stereotype of top-down and bottom-up, haven't we? And truly, we're a highly organized religious body, and we have, diocesan structures, we have parish structures, we have conferences of bishops. We do have, as part of our social tradition, the emphasis on subsidiarity. If we can address something at the local level, it's much better than trying to spend a lot of money at a higher level and so forth. But we have a teaching office, and we do strive very much for communion, for being in communion with one another. And that means that at particular levels, when operations are put into effect, they're governed by principles that work throughout the communion of the Catholic Church. That's an important value to us, and that's part of our structure. We're not congregationally based, even though I think a growing number of Catholics think more in terms of their parish involvement, in terms of their identity. But we try to preserve a kind of consensus on an understanding what the tradition is. Lots of lively debate about what that is, but that's very different than how evangelicals work together. It seems to me they have important statements of conscience. They try to gather a certain persuasive mass around statements. We've joked a little bit about a 1973 statement that Ron was engineering behind, and that was very much part of his career, putting that statement into effect. But it's a different kind of persuasive force and power. The NAE and the USCCB are not exactly parallel organizations, certainly not in size, but they're not parallel in terms of constituency. Yet at the same time, and that's part of the unevenness that we have to learn to deal with. And it's something that we as Catholics should be very conscientious of. At times we tend to be overbearing in how organized our tradition is, not try to talk down to the efforts that are being made when we have a compendium of layered texts that require specialists to interpret. Yes, I think, but that on the lid level, that means less and less. Mm-hmm. It's the encounter of people of faith, and they come for who they are, and formed as they are, for better or for worse. On the earlier question, I remember Karl Rahner, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, is reputed to have said, "Thank heavens Catholics aren't asked to explain the Trinity and Incarnation before going to communion." It'd be very short lines, I think.
We don't want the Iowa step test for communion.
But at the same time, we need to encourage people to come together because they're very concerned about what's going on in their state regarding immigrants, or the direction of state legislation. Maybe it's anti-Sharia legislation. And should they be concerned about this because of people of justice? And it's so I think on the lived level, congregation to parish, or evangelical center to Catholic center, or activist to activist, these are less and less of importance. Certainly when you do want to do a national campaign, yes, we have all kinds of different structural ways of proceeding.
One final quick question. Can I just
want to make one comment?
Yeah.
Just one that I want people to really understand. That is, that on the evangelical side, it means that there are people who claim to be evangelicals and can get television coverage and so forth and say some horrendous things. And there just isn't a pope, there aren't bishops, there aren't anything, except for one case like when Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson were saying horrendous things about Muhammad the prophet. The National Association of Evangelicals sent a letter to them saying in polite language, well, I should keep it in polite language, please be quiet. You're making so many problems for Christians in relation to Muslims, for missionaries in Muslim lands, for Christians in Muslim lands. Please be quiet. And they did get more quiet. That was the best we could do. But they didn't have to listen. You know, there was no authority structure like that. But what I'm trying to say to everybody is, I'm just apologizing for a lot of things that a lot of people that call themselves evangelicals say that, believe me, I don't want to identify with.
I think we'll leave it right there. Thank you for your questions.